Welcome to Climate Action at Home, a series to support homeowners to take action to meet the challenges of climate change. In 2016, the Greater Peterborough area developed its Climate Change Action Plan that targeted a 30% reduction in emissions by the year 2031. Within it, it recognized that the housing sector is a key area to lower community emissions. Homes can achieve substantial drops in emissions by 20 to 40% through improvements to home energy efficiency, such as improving building envelope and upgrading home heating systems. To become a net zero carbon neutral home, GHGs can be eliminated even further by undergoing a deep energy retrofit. A primary strategy to achieve carbon neutrality at home is to produce clean energy on your property. In our region, solar energy is an effective and accessible option. Sean Flanagan of Flanagan & Son Solar will highlight opportunities of installing solar on your home.
A homeowner can achieve carbon neutrality in their home in a few ways. One is to reduce the demand for electricity in the home. The other way is to switch from fuels that result in large greenhouse gas emissions like natural gas and fuel oil to energy sources that have a smaller carbon footprint, like electricity from the Ontario electrical grid. In this region, solar electricity is typically installed as part of a solar net meter system. And the way that works is that the local utility, either Peterborough Utilities or Hydro One, will install a bidirectional meter that can track electricity coming into the house but also being sent back out onto the grid. Solar panels are typically installed on the roof of a house. Many houses can only support about 10 kilowatts or so of electricity, and that may not be enough to meet the energy demands for the house on an annual basis. And so it's important that energy conservation is taken into consideration to reduce the energy demand so that the solar array will be able to supply all the needs for the house on an annual basis. The most important consideration for siting a solar array is to minimize shading. So that's shading from other buildings or trees or chimneys or dormers or anything like that. It's most common to install solar panels on the south side of a building. That's the optimal position. If it's a shingled roof, it's important to look at the condition of the shingles and the age of the shingles to make a decision whether it might make sense to replace the shingles before actually installing the solar panels on the roof. A metal roof has an advantage in that the metal roof will probably outlive the 30-year lifespan of the solar panels. Ground-mounted systems are also possible. They're typically more common in a rural setting just because of the space that's required to install them. Ground-mounted systems have an advantage in that we can choose the tilt angle and the orientation of the solar panels to optimize the output. But ground-mounted systems typically cost about 10 to 20% more than a roof-mounted system. A 10 kilowatt solar roof-mounted net meter system generally costs around $25,000 as an installed cost.
To achieve carbon neutrality at home, you want your heating system to be electric and your house to be energy efficient. Chris Magwood, the Executive Director at the Endeavour Centre, will highlight opportunities for building envelope improvements and alternative heating solutions.
If you want to reach zero carbon for your house, the first place to start is with making the building as energy efficient as possible. So that's addressing both air tightness and insulation in the building to make sure that the actual amount of energy that you need is the smallest to start with. So regardless of the carbon content or how you're making that energy, if the amount is small, that's going to be the best place to start. A lot of people think it's sort of insulation first, but really, if you can make the building as airtight as possible and then be using sort of a mechanical ventilation system, that's going to address the biggest chunk of the energy pie. The second part is to not necessarily worry so much about how much insulation. People get really obsessed with R values for deep energy retrofits, but to make sure that that insulation is continuous. If you've increased the air tightness of the building and added insulation and made sure that insulation is continuous, at a certain point, you're then going to need to upgrade your windows. Once you reach a certain level of energy efficiency everywhere else in the building, you're really going to need to move to a triple pane window in order to kind of make the next step of improvement. The materials you choose for your deep energy retrofit can actually have a huge impact on the overall carbon footprint. One of the things to remember with the material selection is that the energy you're going to save in your building is sort of happens over a long period of time, but the emissions for the materials are this burst that kind of happens when you do the work. What you want to make sure is that the materials you're putting into the deep energy retrofit don't have a carbon footprint that outweighs the benefit of doing that work in the first place. Once you've got the building to the point where you're not using very much energy, then it becomes really straightforward to electrify the house. You know, there are some really traditional ways to get to an electrified house, you know, using electric resistance heating, baseboards and things like that. But electric heat pumps are a really efficient way to use that electricity. So there's actually two kinds of heat pumps for residential use. One being an air source heat pump, and that's kind of the box that you see hung on people's walls. And what that's doing is taking heat out of the ambient air, even at really cold temperatures, and turning it into heat in the building. And the other is a ground source heat pump, which people call geothermal. And what you're doing there is using the stable temperature below the frost line in the earth to provide that source of heat for the heat pump to convert into heat. What we've found, especially in the more urban properties we've looked at, the cost of the ground source heat pump is high enough that the difference in efficiency between the ground source and the air source doesn't pay off for a long time. But if you are out in the county and have either an existing well that you could be using or the space and the room to be able to excavate and put the ground source heat pump in, it is a slightly more efficient way. The beauty of installing a heat pump is that it's both a heater and an air conditioner. Literally the same device runs in one direction and puts the heat in the house, and it can run in the other direction and take the heat out of the house. So it's a really effective way to kind of combine heating and cooling in one unit. If you do a really good deep energy retrofit on your building and it's airtight and well insulated, it should cost you less to run an air source heat pump than your gas furnace in your less insulated house. There are really good software programs that can create an energy model of your building, and that's such a worthwhile thing to do if you're considering any kind of energy retrofit. Have an energy modeler, look at your building, make a model of it, and you can just run lots of scenarios. What if I put R40 in the attic? What if I put R80? What if I keep the double pane windows? What if I go to triple pane windows? It's such a great way to figure out the kind of cost-benefit analysis. Like, instead of just guessing, oh, I'll put a bunch of insulation in and see what happens, the energy model can really, help you hone in and know what the result is going to be.
A final step towards net zero is to offset your remaining household emissions. Brianna Salmon, the Executive Director of GreenUp, will explain more about carbon offsetting.
One of the most important things that we can do in our homes to achieve carbon neutrality is actually to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with our home. But even with those things, we may not get our emissions to zero. We may still be using more energy than we're producing, especially during peak periods. So one of the things that we can actually do to achieve carbon neutrality is to purchase carbon offsetting or to participate in carbon offsetting programs. And what we mean when we say carbon offsetting is that we're actually making investments in environmental protection programs that have a negative carbon impact. So those could be projects that store carbon or sequester carbon or actually draw down carbon from the atmosphere. So when we think of big carbon offsetting programs, what we often mean is making investments in renewable energy projects like wind or solar or biogas. But offsetting can also support projects that are nature-based solutions. So those could be things like forest management or tree planting or ecosystem restoration. If you're looking at purchasing carbon offsets, there are lots of Canadian companies that support carbon negative projects in Canada, and so those are really great options. If you want to try and sequester carbon on your own property, you could do tree planting yourself. One of the important things to think about when we talk about carbon offsetting is that we're actually really looking at long-term projects. So if you're going to be doing tree planting, you really want to make sure that you're choosing the trees that are right for your property, that they'll have the best chance to grow big and to live really long lives and to store as much carbon and for as long as possible. But if we can't get to zero, offsetting programs are a great way to get us that final mile.
Becoming carbon neutral in our homes isn't easy, but it is possible. Although the renovations required to achieve net zero are significant, there are a number of programs and resources available to support you. To find out more about current resources and incentive programs, you can visit the GreenUp website to learn more. This video was produced on Treaty 20 Mississauga territory in the traditional territory of the Mississauga Chippewa Nations. We are grateful to live and work on these lands.